Karen told me to cover up. I'm breastfeeding after arresting her son. The flashing blue and red lights of the patrol car painted the otherwise quiet suburban street in a chaotic strobe. The air was thick with the scent of damp asphalt and the low hum of police radios. It had been a relatively routine call, a noise complaint that had escalated into something more significant when we discovered the underage drinking and a small stash of what appeared to be marijuana at the residence. The homeowner, a frantic and flustered Karen Mitchell, had been less than cooperative, her initial indignation at the disruption quickly turning to outrage as the situation unfolded, and her son, 15-year-old Chad, found himself in handcuffs. Meadowbrook, for all its manicured lawns and stringent HOA regulations, wasn't immune to the realities of teenage rebellion. And Karen Mitchell, the self-appointed guardian of its pristine image, was now facing the very thing she likely railed against at countless neighborhood meetings. Her son, the apple of her eye and the supposed epitome of suburban propriety, was currently sitting in the back of my patrol car, his youthful bravado slowly giving way to a nervous pallor. My partner, Officer Davies, was securing the scene, collecting evidence, and speaking with the other teenagers involved. My focus, after ensuring Chad's safety and informing him of his rights, had shifted to the logistics of transport and processing. It had been a long shift already, and the adrenaline was starting to wane, replaced by a familiar weariness that went beyond just the hours on the clock. Adding to the usual demands of the job was the fact that I was also a new mother. My daughter Lily was 3 months old and still exclusively breastfed. My husband Mark was usually my rock and support, but he was out of town on a business trip. I had managed to pump during my brief meal break earlier, but Lily's feeding schedule was relentless, and the time was fast approaching for another nursing session. As Officer Davies and I prepared to transport Chad to the precinct, Karen's presence was a constant, agitated whirlwind. She peppered us with questions, accusations, and demands, her initial shock having morphed into a fierce denial of her son's involvement. Her HOA Karen persona was in full force, her sense of entitlement clashing spectacularly with the reality of her son's arrest. "This is outrageous," she declared, her voice shrill. "My Chad would never do such a thing. You must have the wrong boy. This is harassment. I know my rights. I'm calling my lawyer." Officer Davies, seasoned in dealing with upset parents, handled her with professional calm, reiterating the evidence and the legal procedures. I focused on Chad, ensuring he understood the situation and remained cooperative. The drive to the precinct was tense and silent, save for Karen's occasional outbursts from her own vehicle, which she insisted on following us in. Once at the station, the process of booking and processing began. Chad, now visibly scared, was more compliant, answering questions with mumbled responses. Karen, however, remained a vocal presence, her indignation echoing through the usually sterile environment of the precinct. I had just finished the initial paperwork and was waiting for the next step in the process when the familiar tug of my milk letdown began. Lily wouldn't wait for anyone's convenience, least of all a police precinct's processing schedule. I discreetly informed Officer Davies that I needed a few minutes and found a relatively quiet corner in a community relations room that was temporarily unoccupied. It wasn't ideal, but it offered a modicum of privacy. I situated myself as comfortably as possible, trying to be as discreet as I could while still ensuring Lily could latch properly. It was a moment of stark contrast, the sterile official environment of the police station juxtaposed with the primal, intimate act of nourishing my child. Just as Lily had latched and a sense of relief washed over me, a shadow fell across the doorway. It was Karen Mitchell, her face still flushed with anger and her eyes red-rimmed. She had apparently been pacing the precinct, her anxiety and outrage still at a fever pitch. She stopped short when she saw me, her expression shifting from fury to one of utter disbelief, and then, predictably, to one of intense disapproval. "Well, I never," she exclaimed, her voice sharp and carrying across the quiet room. "This is a police station. Have you no sense of decency? There are children present. You can't just do that. Out in the open. Cover yourself up. This is highly inappropriate." Her words, laced with her characteristic self-righteousness and disregard for the circumstances, hit me like a slap. I looked up at her, Lily still latched and nursing peacefully, the exhaustion of the long shift and the emotional aftermath of the arrest weighing heavily on me. The irony of the situation was almost unbearable. The mother of the teenager I had just arrested was now berating me for the perfectly natural act of feeding my own child, completely oblivious to the shared link between us. The stage was set for a confrontation where the personal and the professional, the law and motherhood, would collide head-on. Karen's voice, sharp with indignation, echoed in the small community relations room, momentarily disrupting the quiet rhythm of Lily's nursing. My initial weariness gave way to a surge of irritation. The audacity of this woman, whose son was currently being processed for a crime, to barge in and dictate how I cared for my infant was astounding. "Ma'am," I said calmly, trying to maintain a professional tone despite the rising frustration, "I understand you're upset, but I'm simply feeding my baby. It's a natural and necessary act." Karen scoffed, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Natural or not, this is hardly the place for such a private display. There are standards of decency to uphold, even in a police station. Have you no consideration for others?" "With all due respect, ma'am," I replied, my voice gaining a firmer edge, "my priority at the moment is my child's needs. I'm trying to be as discreet as possible." I subtly shifted my position, attempting to shield Lily from direct view without disrupting her feeding. Karen remained unmoved, her disapproval radiating off her in palpable waves. "Discreet? You're sitting in the middle of a public room exposed. It's frankly disgusting. You should find a more appropriate place, like a restroom or cover up." The sheer entitlement in her voice was infuriating. This was a woman whose son had just been caught engaging in illegal activities, yet she felt entitled to dictate the maternal care of the arresting officer. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. "Ma'am," I said, taking a deep breath to maintain control, "I am a working mother on a long shift. This room was the most private space available at the moment. My baby needs to eat." Karen's face hardened. "Then perhaps you should have made more appropriate arrangements for childcare if your personal needs interfere with your professional duties." The condescending jab was clear. My patience finally began to fray. "My personal needs, and as you call them, are the needs of my infant child, and I am handling them as best I can while still performing my duties as a police officer." I deliberately emphasized the last part, hoping the weight of my profession might finally register with her. However, Karen seemed oblivious to the subtle warning. Her focus remained solely on what she perceived as a violation of public decorum. "A police officer should maintain a professional image at all times," she insisted. "This display is anything but professional. What kind of example are you setting?" Before I could respond, Officer Davies entered the room, a confused expression on his face. "Everything all right in here, Alex? I heard voices." He glanced from Karen's agitated face to me, partially obscured while nursing Lily. Karen immediately seized the opportunity. "Officer, I am appalled by the behavior of your colleague. She is indecently exposing herself in a public area. This is a police station, for heaven's sake." Officer Davies' eyebrows shot up. He looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. He knew I had a young baby, and he knew the demands of breastfeeding. "Karen," Officer Davies said, his tone calm but firm. "Officer, my last name, is taking care of her child. It's a natural and protected act." Karen scoffed. "Protected? By whom? This is still highly inappropriate. I intend to file a formal complaint." The threat hung in the air, another layer of absurdity to the already surreal situation. This woman, whose son was facing legal consequences, was threatening to file a complaint against the arresting officer for the crime of feeding her child. "You are welcome to file a complaint, ma'am," I said, my voice finally losing its professional neutrality and taking on a sharper edge. "However, I would suggest focusing your attention on your son's current situation. He is being processed for underage drinking and possession of illegal substances." Phew. The mention of Chad seemed to momentarily deflate Karen's outrage regarding my breastfeeding. A flicker of worry crossed her face, but it was quickly replaced by her characteristic denial. "There must be some mistake. My Chad would never—" "Ma'am," Officer Davies interrupted, his tone firm, "we have evidence. Your son was at the residence where the illegal substances were found, and he admitted to consuming alcohol." Karen's agitation returned, but this time it was directed at us, the officers. "This is all a misunderstanding. You're targeting my son. This is police brutality. I demand to speak to your supervisor." The situation escalated further as Karen's distress over her son's arrest intertwined with her self-righteous indignation over my breastfeeding. She followed Officer Davies and me as we moved Chad through the precinct for processing, her voice a constant stream of accusations, demands, and threats. I tried to remain focused on my duties, answering her questions when necessary, but primarily directing my attention to Chad and ensuring the procedures were followed correctly. Lily thankfully remained latched and relatively calm amidst the escalating tension. The irony of the situation was a constant, bitter undercurrent. This woman, so concerned with public decency and upholding the law, was now actively hindering law enforcement officers in the performance of their duties because she disapproved of how one of them was caring for her child. The HOA Karen of Meadowbrook was in full meltdown, her entitlement clashing spectacularly with the realities of police work and motherhood. And little did she know, the officer she was so vehemently criticizing was the very person who held a significant amount of control over her son's immediate future. The conflict was reaching a boiling point, the personal and the professional about to collide in a truly dramatic fashion. Karen's escalating tirade followed us through the precinct like a persistent, buzzing insect. Her demands to speak to a supervisor were met with the standard procedure. She would have the opportunity to do so once her son's processing was complete. This only seemed to fuel her outrage. "This is unbelievable," she shrieked, drawing the attention of several other officers and staff members. "I am being treated like a criminal while your officer is committing a lewd act in public." She gestured dramatically towards me, where Lily was still nursing discreetly under my uniform shirt. Officer Davies, his patience wearing thin, stopped and turned to face her squarely. "Karen, I need you to calm down. Officer, my last name, is not committing any lewd act. She is feeding her child. It is her right, and it is not illegal or indecent." "But it's unprofessional," Karen insisted, her voice trembling with indignation. "She is in uniform. She represents the law. This is a disgrace." The hypocrisy of her statement, her concern for professional image while her son was being booked for illegal activities, was almost comical if the situation weren't so tense. Just then, Sergeant Miller, my direct supervisor, approached, drawn by the commotion. "What's going on here?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over the scene. Karen's agitated face, Officer Davies' weary expression, and me trying to remain composed while Lily continued to nurse. "Sergeant," Karen immediately interjected, her voice rising in pitch, "I demand you take action against this officer. She is behaving in a highly inappropriate manner. I intend to file a formal complaint with Internal Affairs." Sergeant Miller, a seasoned officer who had seen his fair share of unusual situations, looked at Karen with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Ma'am, what exactly is the issue?" "This officer," Karen said, pointing a trembling finger in my direction, is exposing herself and breastfeeding her baby in the middle of the police station. It's disgusting and unprofessional." Sergeant Miller's gaze finally settled on me. He saw the slight shift in my uniform shirt, the tiny hand occasionally peeking out. Understanding dawned on his face. He looked back at Karen, his expression hardening slightly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm and authoritative, "Officer, my last name, is a new mother who is doing what she needs to do to care for her child while still performing her duties. Breastfeeding is a natural and legally protected act. There is nothing disgusting or lewd about it. In fact, I commend her for her dedication to both her job and her child." Karen's face flushed crimson. "But it's still unprofessional. This is a police station." "What is unprofessional, ma'am?" Sergeant Miller countered, his voice gaining an edge. "Is your behavior right now. You are disrupting the operations of this precinct while your son is being processed for serious offenses. I suggest you focus your energy on that, rather than harassing a hardworking officer for taking care of her baby." The sergeant's words seemed to finally penetrate Karen's wall of self-righteous indignation. A flicker of something, perhaps shame, perhaps a dawning realization of the precariousness of her son's situation, crossed her face. Just then, Officer Davies returned from escorting Chad to the juvenile processing area. "Sergeant, Chad Mitchell is being processed. He's cooperating, but he's clearly scared." The mention of her son seemed to snap Karen back to the immediate crisis. Her focus shifted, her outrage at my breastfeeding momentarily forgotten in her concern for Chad. My son! I need to see my son. You will have the opportunity to speak with him once the initial processing is complete, ma'am, Sergeant Miller said, his tone firm but not unkind. Right now, we need to follow procedure. As Sergeant Miller directed Karen to a waiting area, he gave me a brief, understanding nod. You all right, officer? My last name? He asked quietly. Yes, Sergeant. Thank you, I replied, a wave of relief washing over me. Lily had finished nursing and had drifted off to sleep, nestled securely against me. The climax of the immediate conflict, Karen's public berating and Sergeant Miller's firm intervention, had passed, but the underlying tension remained. Karen's son was facing legal consequences, and her initial arrogance and entitlement had been starkly juxtaposed with the reality of the situation and my dual roles as a police officer and a mother. The next stage of the climax unfolded as Karen was finally allowed to speak with Chad in a private room. Officer Davies and I remained involved in the processing, the paperwork and procedures demanding our attention. However, the weight of Karen's earlier behavior and her complete obliviousness to the fact that the officer she had so readily condemned was the very person who had arrested her son hung heavy in the air. The moment of ultimate revelation occurred when Sergeant Miller needed to review some details with Chad and requested my presence as the arresting officer. As I entered the small interview room where Chad was sitting with his visibly distraught mother, Karen's eyes widened in shock. She looked from me, in my full police uniform, to her son, and then back to me. The realization dawning on her face with the force of a physical blow. The officer who had indecently exposed herself was the same officer who had placed her son in handcuffs. The lewd act she had so vehemently condemned had been performed by the very person who held a significant amount of authority over her child's immediate future. The color drained from Karen's face. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The self-righteous indignation that had fueled her earlier tirade vanished, replaced by a look of utter disbelief and a dawning, terrifying understanding of the potential consequences of her arrogance. The woman who had demanded I cover up was now facing the stark reality that her own behavior had been directed at the very officer who held her son's fate in her hands. The sterile interview room crackled with the unspoken weight of her monumental blunder. The silence in the small interview room was thick and heavy, broken only by Chad's occasional sniffles. Karen's face was a mask of shock and dawning horror. The realization that the officer she had so vehemently berated for breastfeeding was the same officer who had arrested her son, hung in the air like a palpable tension. Sergeant Miller, oblivious to the full extent of Karen's internal turmoil, addressed Chad with a calm but firm tone, reviewing the details of the arrest and the charges against him. I stood nearby, observing, Lily still asleep and secure in her carrier. Karen's gaze flickered between me and her son, the earlier fire in her eyes completely extinguished, replaced by a look of utter mortification. The entitled HOA Karen had seemingly vanished, replaced by a woman grappling with the profound consequences of her own arrogance. When Sergeant Miller finished speaking with Chad, he turned to Karen. Ma'am, your son will be released into your custody tonight, pending a court hearing. He understands the seriousness of the charges. Karen nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on me, a silent plea for understanding in their depths. The bravado and denial she had displayed earlier were completely gone. As we prepared for Chad's release, Karen finally found her voice, her tone subdued and laced with a profound sense of shame. Officer, my last name, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I am so incredibly sorry. For my behavior earlier, for what I said, I had no idea. I met her gaze, my expression neutral but not unkind. Ms. Mitchell, I said calmly, you were understandably upset about your son. However, that does not excuse your disrespectful behavior towards me while I was caring for my child. Karen's eyes welled up with tears. I know. I was awful. I made assumptions. I was judgmental, and I had no right, especially knowing now. Her voice trailed off, unable to fully articulate her remorse. Ms. Mitchell, Sergeant Miller interjected, his tone firm, but with a hint of understanding. Your son has made a mistake. Officer, my last name, was doing her job. Perhaps this entire situation can serve as a learning experience for both of you. As Chad was released into Karen's custody, she offered me a brief, tearful apology. Officer, I truly am sorry. I nodded curtly. I hope you and your son learn from this, Ms. Mitchell. The resolution of the immediate conflict, Karen's realization and her subsequent apology, was swift and somewhat anticlimactic. In the days and weeks that followed, a noticeable shift occurred in Karen's demeanor around Meadowbrook. The imperious HOA Karen seemed to have retreated, replaced by a quieter, more subdued presence. The sharp reprimands and unsolicited judgments seemed to cease. There were even whispers among neighbors about Karen being surprisingly polite during the last HOA meeting. I occasionally saw her in town, and each time she offered a brief, almost hesitant nod of acknowledgement. The memory of her outrage at my breastfeeding, juxtaposed with the reality of my role in her son's arrest, seemed to linger in the air between us. Chad, thankfully, seemed to have learned a valuable lesson. There were no further incidents involving him, and I heard through local channels that he was actively involved in community service as part of his probation. The satisfying resolution wasn't about Karen facing legal repercussions for her rudeness. It was about the profound and personal impact of her realization. The entitled HOA Karen had been forced to confront the consequences of her judgmental nature in a deeply ironic and personal way. The very officer she had so readily condemned was the one who held a significant amount of power in a situation involving her own family. For me, the incident served as a stark reminder of the challenges faced by working mothers, particularly in demanding professions. Balancing the needs of my infant with the responsibilities of law enforcement was a constant juggling act, and Karen's unwarranted criticism had been a painful reminder of the judgment and lack of understanding that can sometimes come from unexpected places.